Okay, hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome to this session. We are going to be talking about optimizing and streamlining Alma workflows. We'll be talking about all kinds of different things that you can do in Alma. As Ray mentioned, I will be monitoring chat. I will do my best to repeat the question that I am answering, just so that anybody who is following along in the recording will know what question is being answered. This session is going to be pretty much within PowerPoint. Given the idiosyncrasies that can happen with the internet, I do tend to be pretty PowerPoint heavy in these types of presentations. If we have time, I am happy to jump into Alma, but in general, everything that you need to see will be screenshotted pretty heavily. So we should be able to go from there. So as I mentioned, my name is Megan Drake. I've been a librarian for 15 years now, and I have been at Ex Libris for about 5 years. I am currently the team lead of the Premium Expert Services team, and my team handles any sort of premium one-on-one, usually paid services. So optimized services, training services, any special projects, as well as implementation workshops within North America. Prior to doing that, I was an implementation consultant focusing on Alma and Primo and consortia implementations primarily, given my background, which is that before I joined Ex Libris, I was actually a customer. I was a systems and applications librarian at Pacific University, which was a member of the Orbis Cascade Alliance. So I was very involved in Pacific's project to migrate, along with the Alliance, of 30-some individual institutions, most of them running Millennium, to a shared Alma Primo instance with a network zone. It was actually the first instance of the network zone. So I always like to give that information because I think it gives me a very interesting perspective on Alma workflows and utilizing Alma, because I spent 2 years with Alma as a customer, both going through implementation and then managing a live system before I joined Ex Libris. So I have had my feet on both sides of the aisle. So I am able to speak about Alma and how libraries use Alma from personal experience, as well as from what I have seen in my 5 years at Ex Libris, seeing multiple libraries and how they handle things. So today we're going to be talking about what you can do to optimize your use of Alma. So we'll be talking about small configuration tweaks, as well as some analytics reports across all areas of cataloging of acquisitions, resource management, and fulfillment, things that you can start to do now to streamline your configurations and workflows. As Ray mentioned, questions are welcome. It is entirely possible that I may not be able to answer all questions simply because of the nature of this topic. Optimizing workflows and workflow analysis can sometimes be very, very focused on institutional and local best practices. And so oftentimes there is more of a conversation that needs to be had. And without having the ability to have that question, I may not be able to answer that question for you in very strong detail. But we will do our best to answer things as they come up. So as I mentioned, we will be going through acquisitions, electronic resources management, fulfillment, and various other configuration optimizations within that. And then we will spend some time looking at some analytics reports that you can do in expert services. And then we'll spend a brief amount of time looking at the premium expert services offered by Ex Libris. So let's start out by talking about various configuration optimizations, starting in acquisition. So as you know, the purchase type that you choose when you are creating a purchase order is very important. It's very important to pick the right thing at the point of order. Purchase type controls the inventory formats that is created, whether the inventory is physical or electronic. It controls continuity. if this resource is a one-time resource, or if this is a continuous resource that you will be regularly receiving upon, or if this is a standing order, as well as the acquisition/item material type. Now, I call this out specifically with the acquisition item material type because the information held in the material type in a purchase order line is not as granular as the material type that is held in item records themselves. So, as you know, the options that are presented within this purchase type can be confusing, and there are a lot of them. And it's important, as you know, to pick the correct one because inventory is created as soon as you order. So one of the very first recommendations that I make for streamlining Alma is to limit down the number of purchase types that are presented to people when they are placing an order. To do that, you need to go to Acquisitions, and in Acquisitions Configuration, you will choose PO line types. When you choose that, it takes you to a table. This table is not customizable in that you cannot add anything and you cannot remove anything. What you can do is edit it, though. So the first thing to do here is to export this table. I have an arrow here in the screenshot pointing to the export option, which enables you to export the table to Excel. You cannot control what columns export or do not export. It just exports everything that it does. But when you export that entire table, you then get a really solid Excel spreadsheet with all of the various purchase types. This next slide is a screenshot of a small number of purchase types. This specific example is all of the purchase types in Alma that are of a one-time continuity and a physical inventory. The source to combo here is the continuity, so this example is one time. I have filtered here to only display one time. Source 3 combo is the inventory. So here I have filtered only to physical inventory. And then source 4 combo here is the physical or the item acquisitions material type. So these are the only 11 material types that are associated with physical one-time orders. So this is where this recommendation starts to come into play because the material type that is held in the item record is much, much, much more granular. There are a large number of options here. So setting the material type on the order is not necessarily the most useful because you can do much better reporting when you report in analytics based on the actual item material type in the item record. So my recommendation here is to streamline these down and only have one per option here. So in the case of physical, what you would do is you would go through and highlight the specific one that you want to retain. My generalized recommendation here is to choose physical one time. You could also choose print book one time. I will point out that they are both one time physical with the material type here of book. The reason that I recommend physical one time as opposed to print book one time is that it can be confusing for frontline staff. If they have a DVD, for example, in hand that they're placing an order on, there couldn't be a point of confusion as to why print book is the option to choose when this is not a book that is being ordered. So physical one time is usually the recommendation here. So you'll go through this spreadsheet and you will change your filters for all of the various continuities. So you will iterate this through for physical one time, physical continuations, physical standing orders, electronic one time, electronic continuations, etc. And the reason that I suggest highlighting what you want to keep is then when you have gone through the process, you will then have a spreadsheet that looks something like this, where there will be highlights of the rows that you have chosen to keep when you choose to remove all the filters. You can see here there's some print in here, there's some electronic in here, there's a lot of different options. So then, once you have gone through and highlighted everything, you can then take that spreadsheet of all of the highlighted rows and go back into Alma. When you go back into Alma, into that row, into that table that I talked about, where you cannot, that we exported initially, where you cannot edit, in that you cannot add rows or you cannot delete rows, and you can't really edit anything. The only thing that you can do here is you can disable or enable the options, which stops so then what you need to do is you need to go through and disable everything that is appearing in this list that you do not want. So then the only things that are enabled are the options that you have highlighted. What that means is that anything that is disabled will not show in the dropdown of the order options. You can rest assured that any purchase order line types that you have disabled, any existing orders associated with those purchase types will still be in Alma just fine. You have not deleted those purchase types, you've just disabled them. So they will still be in existence. You just may want to include them when you are doing reporting on previous orders. So this next slide then is the list of recommended purchase types that I would like, that I recommend in general to be retained. So you need to have 3 different physical for physical subscription or continuation, physical one-time, and physical standing order monograph. You will need 5 for electronic resources, optionally 5, usually 4, because electronic collections and electronic titles are different types of orders. So you will need to have an electronic collection subscription and an electronic collection one-time for the collections that you order. Plus, you will also want to have electronic title subscription and electronic title one-time for your standalone orders of ebooks or standalone journals. And optionally, you can also include electronic title standing order if you utilize that. It's pretty rare that I do see electronic title standing order being used. Usually that's exclusively for physical resources, but if you use it, it's there. And then you will also want to have access service subscription as well as other service one time. And those are for your non-inventory orders, things like memberships and things like that. So that is in general what we recommend to retain for purchase types. And I will pause for a moment to see if there are any questions in the chat. And while I am waiting for any questions that may come through at the chat, I will note that you can feel free to type your questions at any time. You don't need to wait for me to ask for questions, and then I will just answer them as I can. So I'll just give it another minute or two to see if there are any questions within chat. Seeing nothing, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next recommendation, but I do have the chat window open, so feel free to type questions at any time, and I will answer them as I see them. So my next recommendation here is for the use of order line templates. So if you have not been using order line templates, it is very, very useful functionality to consider going down the road of implementing. You can implement order line templates for common combinations of vendor and fund and location. If, for example, you always order from vendor X and that is associated with fund Y in location Z, then in that situation, you might want to consider having an order line template so you don't have to always pick those items. They will be automatically filled for you. Another time that order line templates could be used is if you would be considering moving the electronic resources ordering process from acquisitions to the electronic resources specialists at your library. This is something that I see often in libraries that have been live in Alma for a while, in that the acquisition staff have the skills and knowledge and capabilities about how to make orders. but they may not be as knowledgeable about electronic resources, and they may not know what specific resource needs to be ordered. And on the flip side, the electronic resources staff know exactly what resource needs to be ordered, but they may not be as knowledgeable in the ordering and what needs to happen with an order. So utilizing PO line templates and order templates allows electronic resources staff to create the order based upon what they know needs to be ordered from the community zone, have some baseline information put in there, and then acquisitions can continue the process. Another way that order line templates could be used is if you want to consider moving the processing of gift orders completely to cataloging. Oftentimes, the way that libraries process gifts is they bring in a bibliographic record from whatever source they are bringing in bib records, and then they are manually adding holdings records and item records. If you utilize order line templates to instead create gift orders, there's a number of benefits here. First of all, the acquisition method of gift does not require fund or price information, so you don't need to worry about artificially associating a price with it. However, if you do utilize gift orders, then you have the ability to then report on that through analytics. You can see how many gifts you have processed. You can optionally associate reporting codes with those gift orders so that you can then process those orders. Once they have been created, they then go through the entire workflow of all of your other standard receiving, post-receiving processing. So there's a better flow there. Plus, when you create the order, Alma automatically creates the holdings record and the item record. So you have Alma doing work for you, and you're not having to manually create things. I did have a question come through, and so I'm going to pause before I move on further in the order line templates to answer this question, which is, can you please give examples for access service or for other access? So that is referring to these purchase types. So this access service subscription and other access, other service one time, these would be for things that you pay for that you need to reflect in Alma, but that you do not get any inventory for. So for example, if you pay for a membership to the American Chemical Society, you pay for that membership, and with the membership, you also get some electronic resources. But the main thing that you're paying for is that membership to the American Chemical Society. In that situation, you may want to use that access service subscription to note that. Other service one time that could also be used for one-time purchases of additional licenses for an ebook or something along those lines. Things that you are paying for that you need to reflect in Alma, but that don't necessarily have inventory in play. You've already purchased the electronic resource that allows for 3 concurrent users, but you're adding an additional 2 concurrent users on top of that for an already activated resource. So you would consider potentially using that other service one time for that. Okay. So moving on, and let's look at now the process of creating an order line template. So this, in this example, I am ordering the Big Lebowski, and so this is a screenshot of a few different places in an order of places where I have put information in. So in this order, I have associated it with a vendor. I have also associated this order with a fund. I have associated this order with an acquisition method of purchase at vendor system. I have also associated this order with a material type and a reporting code. All of these pieces of information are all things that can be set in an order line template. So to create the template, once you have created the order and put all of the information in that you want to be retained as a template, The next thing to do before you hit order now or save and continue or anything to move the order on, you need to click on the More Actions menu or the 3 ellipses up at the very top and choose Save as Template. When you do that, it pops this screen up, which allows you to name the template and choose whether or not this template is public. If you want other people to be able to use this order line template, you need to set the template as public. If you have public equals no here, then only you will be able to use that template, which isn't beneficial if you're creating a template to streamline workflows, etc. The other thing I want to call out here is the existing templates drop-down box. What that does is if you need to change or edit or update an existing template, what you can do is do the same process of creating the purchase order, setting the various variables that you need to have in the template. And then when you go to Save as Template, you choose the existing template in the dropdown. That then essentially overwrites what is in that existing template and allows you to update that template. And then when you go through and you are creating the next order, which in this example, I am creating an order on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, another really great Coen Brothers movie. You'll note that in the drop down here, of Load from Template, I chose that media template that I had just created. Once I do that and I click on Create Order, at that point, all of this information that I put into the order automatically comes in with zero interaction from myself. So the vendor comes in, the fund comes in, the acquisition method comes in, as well as the material type and reporting code. So you can see that it's very, very powerful for allowing you to set information and then reuse that time over time. So I'm now going to pause a moment and take a peep at the questions and see where we are. So there is a question, is there any way to change a migrated purchase order line, for example, from physical to electronic? Purchase order lines migrated incorrectly, and so they do not link to electronic portfolios. There is not, you can't, so the answer to that question is sort of multiple, it's a multi-layered question. You can change purchase order types and purchase types, but you can only change them within the same type of inventory and continuity. So you can't change, for example, physical to electronic. That is because when the order is created, inventory is created. So the only way you can change them is if it is within the same physical one-time. For example, you could change it to from a physical one-time order to a print book one-time order, effectively only changing the acquisition item material type. You cannot change continuity, and you cannot change inventory. So for that process, you would need to create orders and then relink them. There's not a way to change that up. Okay. Moving on to acquisition method. This is another place where I recommend streamlining some options here. So that is also in acquisitions configuration, and then you choose under purchase orders, acquisition method. This is another table where you cannot enable or disable any options here. This is a table where you cannot add or remove rows. This is a table, again, similar to purchase type. All you can do is enable or disable. So there are a number of acquisition methods that show in the dropdown, some of which apply to libraries and a lot of which don't apply to most libraries. So you'll want to go through and disable anything that you are not currently using. The ones that I generally recommend to be retained are purchase at vendor system, which should be your default, approval, gift, and technical. Now, gift and technical are the two acquisition methods that do not require funds, and they do not require pricing. They do require a vendor, though. So if you are going down the road of gift purchase order lines, using templates like we talked about, you'll want to create some sort of a placeholder vendor to use for those purposes. You also, if you may need to also keep purchase enabled if you are sending orders from Alma to a vendor. And if you utilize any kind of depository or anything like that, you may want to consider having that enabled too. But in general, these are the ones that I recommend. Okay, moving on to the next topic, which is the claiming task list. So you can access the claiming task list in two ways, either from the task widget in Alma. Under order lines, there is a line for order lines with claims. You can also access it in the acquisitions menu and choose claim. Both of those take you to the same place, which is this claiming task list. Now, claims are automatically created in Alma once you are live and have scheduled jobs turned on. If this job is turned on, these claims are created when physical materials are not received by the expected receiving date, or electronic resources are not activated by the expected activation date. So this is really great, but the problem is that during the early days after go live, when you're still solidifying your workflows, claims can often be inadvertently created. You have received something but not fully, and so Alma thinks it hasn't shown up yet, even though it is sitting on the shelf in the library. Or you didn't go through the activation process as expected. So oftentimes I have seen claiming task lists of libraries that have been live for a very long time that are in the thousands or even in the tens of thousands. So you need to clean this up so that you can then utilize the claiming task list for what it is meant to be, which is a informational thing to tell you, hey, I need to claim on this. Now, if you're not going to be doing claiming in your library, don't worry about this. But if you do claim heavily, you'll want to clean up this task list so that you can then use it. I always like to highlight here that within the claiming task list itself, you can cancel orders directly from the list, as well as change the expected receiving date. So there are a couple of things you can do directly from within the claiming task list as part of that cleanup process. Okay, moving on to resource management work. So similar to the claiming task list, the activation task list is also an area that can do with cleanup and a little bit of help, usually post-go live. So to get to the activation task list, that also appears in the widget, in the Alma Tasks widget, as well as under Resources, under Manage Inventory, Manage Electronic Resource Activation. Both of these options take you to the same area, which is this activation task list. This task list is also often cluttered due to workflow issues at go live. So what you will want to do is close all old task items after ensuring that the resource is activated. Essentially what happens with this task list is you go through, you activate resources in Alma, but if you don't do the terminal step on the task of choosing done, then these tasks just hang around on the task list, even though everything has actually been activated. So what you'll want to do on each individual line is choose Test Access to make sure that the resource has been activated. And if that resource has indeed been activated and is available in Primo and everything is good to go, you then can go through and choose Done. Choosing Done on the activation task closes out the task and takes it off the active task list, which then allows you to then utilize the task list as it should be used, which is as items that need action. They need to be activated, they need to be troubleshot, and what have you. Again, you'll want to go through and filter the task list and work through by removing the task list by filtering the status date to earliest and go through and click done on all of these items. As you then work through the cleanups, if you are wanting to continue to start using the work, you'll want to filter instead to the most recent date and use statuses to filter by the needed activation work while you're working on all of this. There is a point of information here, which is a really good point. Thank you for this, Jackie, which is that if you have interested users on the order record that are set to be notified when a resource is activated, when you choose done on the activation task, that is what closes out that task and then notifies interested users that indeed this resource has been activated. That is a really, really good point. So that is where you need to do that. Now the statuses, this is a shot of those statuses. These, there are 5 resources, or statuses, excuse me, that in North America we create out of the box, which is localized, proxy, test access, make available, and we had been creating Primo Central, but with the advent of CDI, I believe that now is CDI. So these are statuses that you use to track your work. They don't actually do things in Alma. So you will want to tune these statuses according to what you need to track. So if you are a very large technical services department, where you handle, you have one person who handles the initial activation from the community zone, you have a separate person who proxies resources, you have another person who checks the CDI information, and you need to pass things back and forth, you may use this task list heavily, set statuses, and also optionally assign tasks to people, because that is something else you can do in the activation task list, is assign tasks to others. If, however, you're 1 or 2 people that do everything, you may not use this as heavily. So to tune these e-task statuses, these statuses within the activation task list, you go to Resources, Configuration, and choose e-task statuses. This table is a table that actually can be fully customizable. So you have the option to add rows for adding tasks that you may want to do. You also have the option here to delete rows. So if, for example, you don't do a lot of proxy work, you can delete that row, or you could change things. And the other thing that I see here is that libraries who have been live for a while sometimes move to using this task list for troubleshooting as well. So if they get a report that a resource is not working well, or that needs to have the link troubleshot, they will create an activation task list for that active resource, which then takes it here, and then they'll have a status for troubleshooting and can assign it to the person who does that. So cleaning up this task list and actually clicking done on things then enables you to use it for other options, because essentially this activation task list is very similar to a work order for electronic resources. It enables you to track what is being done to this resource. So you could use it for troubleshooting and the like. Moving on to licenses. So if you decide that you want to go down the road of managing licenses in Alma, you will want to work together as a group the first thing you should do is streamline the license terms. The license terms in Alma is a very, very long list when you create a license of all of the various terms that are active and available in the standard language, the standard licensing language, which I believe is ONIXPL. So all of those options are there, and most libraries don't use all of them. They only use a very small subset. So you will want to agree as a group what should be tracked with licenses, and then you'll want to hide any terms that are not in that agreed upon list. So to hide the terms that are in the agreed upon list, what you will do is in the dropdown, at the very bottom of the dropdown, there looks like there is an extra space. that actually is the blank option that can be checked. When you choose that blank option, it then stops that from displaying in the license creation area. You'll also want to note whether or not you want these license terms to be displayed to the public. Before I move on to the next topic, I did have a question, which is asking me to give a scenario where the activation task list could be used for troubleshooting. So the most recent library that I was on site with doing a workflow optimization, we sort of worked through this process. So let me sort of explain it to you. So they have situations where they will get reports of broken links in Primo. A link isn't working, and so their patrons will send in an email, or I believe they used a ticketing system. So patrons would open a case saying, hey, this link is broken. They had been managing the process completely outside of Alma through emails. They would email somebody and say, hey, this link is broken, can you test it? And so everybody within the library would be emailing each other back and forth, asking for troubleshooting this, and oh, I tried this and it didn't work, try this with the vendor. And so instead, the process that we came up with instead is when the patron reports that the link is broken, at that point, then the person managing the ticketing or the person receiving the email would then go into Alma, find the resource that is associated with this broken link, and then would create an activation task directly on that resource. Give it a status of check access, for example, and then that can then be assigned through the e-task statuses to a specific person who then would get that optionally via email and be told, hey, I need to do this and check on this. So it enables things to be tracked in Alma and eliminated a lot of back and forth with emails and asking about things and emails getting missed because all of these tasks are in Alma. And so then when the resource is working again and the link is no longer broken, then they go through and close out the activation task and notify the patron. So that would be a scenario for utilizing the activation task list for troubleshooting. I hope that answers your question. Okay, moving on to the next topic. Let's talk about item material types. So we talked earlier about how acquisitions material type is nowhere near as granular, and item material types are very, very granular. So this is a little bit of a teaser to a topic that we'll be talking about in a little bit with analytics reports. This is a specific analytics report I wanted to call out here in this area. So in the analytics area, there is a expert services folder that is under the shared folders, and then if you navigate to community and then reports and then shared reports, there's a folder called expert services. So we'll talk about this folder a little bit later, but I just want to tell you that is the path. Then within this folder, there is a report that is titled Item Material Type Usage. This is a very, very useful report because I oftentimes will see a very long tail. This is a snip of the beginning of the item material types usage as well as the end. This is actually not as long of a tail as I have seen. I oftentimes will see hundreds of material types in use at a library, and the vast majority of them just have one item associated or two items associated, which is sort of, it's very difficult to report on. It's very difficult for people who are doing post-receiving processing to choose the right thing. And it can be difficult for patrons to understand what's going on here. So my recommendation is to run this report on your repository and get the list of what you are using and then determine what specific material types you will be using. So for example, there are 2 CD-ROMs and 2 DVD-ROMs in the system. So potentially you may want to combine those and create a single multimedia option here. Or you may want to combine DVD and Blu-ray to just be media. So you'll want to look at your data and determine what material types are the ones that you will be using moving forward. Once you do that, you can then create sets in Alma of the items with those deprecated material types by doing an advanced search for that specific material type, for example, Blu-ray, as I mentioned before. And then you will run the change physical items job and choose the material type that is the correct material type that should be used moving forward to change all of these in bulk. So that will change all of the Blu-rays to DVD or whatever you want to choose. That is the first step, is fixing all of the deprecated material types. But the other thing that you will want to do is disable those deprecated material types so they cannot be used going forward, because otherwise you're always going to be cleaning up behind people who pick a more granular type because it's there. So to do that, you will go to Resources Configuration and choose Physical Material Type. At which point, this is another one of those tables where you can't add rows and you can't delete rows, but you can enable or disable. So you can go through and disable any material types that you are deprecating. Now, the other thing I always like to point out here is that if there is a combined material type that you want to utilize that does not appear in this list, you can change the description so that it appears as that changed thing in drop-downs. You cannot change the code, but you can mess around with Alma a little bit so that it displays with that deprecated type, or it displays with the correct type. Okay, so that is material types. So now let's move on to fulfillment optimization. So the first thing I always like to point out here is a very powerful area of Alma, which is the monitor requests and item processes. You can access it under fulfillment, under resource requests. There is a link called monitor requests and item processes. This area is a holistic view into anything that is on a physical resource institution-wide. So any physical resource that is not on the shelf or has a request queued on it or anything along those lines, you can see all of those items in whole in this one area. So it's very powerful. And the first place that I always like to point out is another thing that is good to continually monitor, but especially immediately after go live. It is the ability to find things that are lost in transit. So this screenshot here on the left is a screenshot of some of the facets that appear when you go to the monitor requests and item processes screen. We will go to request process type and choose transit for reshelving. This transit for reshelving request process type is a specific request process type that is associated with an item as soon as it goes in transit between libraries to be reshelved. You'll then want to facet to older, which will give you everything that has gone into transit more than a month ago. Oftentimes what I will see here is that these are, the most common example is that you have a student worker who is processing item returns and they are not paying attention to the screen, and they scan the first item that has come through the book drop, and that item that came through the book drop has a fulfillment note on it. Because it has a fulfillment note on it, there is a screen, there's a pop-up message that says this item has associated DVDs or something like that. Because this student worker is not looking at the screen, they don't see the pop-up, they grab the next book, scan that book. Because a barcode scan has a carriage return associated with it, that scan of the second book clears the pop-up. They hear the beep that it has been scanned. They take the second book and put it ready to be shelved. Meanwhile, this second book is still in transit because it was never cleared off. So it's a lot of user error that can happen here. So what you then get is a list of items that have been lost in transit, with the request date being the date that they went into transit for reshelving. And oftentimes there can be things that, especially the first time you look at this, there can be thousands. And there can be thousands of things that have been lost in transit but are sitting on the shelf. And Alma thinks they're in transit. Your patrons think that it's not available because it shows in Primo as unavailable. So you can then take this list, export it, and use it as a search to go into the stacks and find these things, and then scan them and make them be available again. So that is the first thing I always recommend that people look. The other thing that request monitoring is useful for is looking at any sort of aged physical item requests. So again, in the request process type area, we will choose patron physical item request, and then choose the status of undefined. Undefined here, and anytime that undefined appears in this request monitoring area, that indicates that it hasn't had an action done on it yet. So in the case of aged physical item requests, these are items that are sitting in a request queue. They are not on the pickup from shelf list. They are not on hold. They are not in transit from another library. They are sitting there because potentially a user has this item checked out and another patron placed a request on it, and then this user never brought it back. So it's just sitting there waiting to be generated. You then get the list of physical item requests. You can then also export that list by clicking on the export option. When you do that, it gives you a list of the title and the type and the requester, which you can then use to contact the requester and say, do you still want this? Would you like me to place an ILL request for this item? So it's a customer service point, a way of giving your patrons what they want and that have potentially they have been waiting for a long time. Okay, the other thing that is useful in this area is the cataloging backlog. So the cataloging backlog, essentially you can see everything that is in the acquisition technical services work order. So you can see everything that is in copy cataloging or physical processing or whatever you utilize for those statuses, as well as how long it has been there. So it's a way of holistically seeing what is in the back of the house at any given time. This applies to any work orders. So you can also see anything that is in a preservation work order, as you can see shows up here, or the search work order. So it's a really good way of seeing holistically what is in any work order. Now, speaking of work orders is a topic in Alma that can get very complicated very quickly. And it can be very tempting to create discrete work order departments and discrete work order types based upon all the different discrete work that you do. But instead of doing that, I strongly recommend that you consider 3 questions when you are considering how to configure and set up your work orders. Question 1, where do people do the work? Do the materials need to transit between buildings or floors? And do the same people do different types of work that are all managed by work orders? So if the work is being performed in one location, and you do not need to track any sort of transit between buildings or floors, and the same people are doing different types of work that are all managed by work orders. For example, you have one person who is doing preservation work, and they're doing binding, and they're also doing some post-receiving processing of barcoding and things like that. In that situation, you will want to use statuses for the different types of work within the out-of-the-box acquisitions work order. Because there is no reason to have multiple departments and force your staff to be constantly having to flip back and forth between the work order departments to process the materials. Everything can be handled within the one out-of-the-box acquisitions work order. Now, on the other hand, if people are doing this work in multiple locations, or you have materials that need to transit between buildings or floors. For example, your preservation department is in a completely different building than your main technical services. And you have different people doing this work. It's all very separated out and siloed. So in that situation, you would create different work order departments for the disparate locations where the work is performed. So perhaps you have one location that does preservation work and binding work that is a separate building from your technical services department. In that situation, you would create a single work order department for preservations and binding, and then use statuses within that department to manage everything that's there, because those staff don't need multiple departments. So that's the generalized thinking of how to look at this. A specific example would be a workflow for handling searching for lost and missing items. So to do that, you would create a new work order called search. This work order can be attached to the circulation desk that is used by the staff who will be performing the work. That can be done by going into the circulation desk configuration and associating that circulation desk with the work order. If you have a stacks maintenance department who is not associated with a circulation desk, then you would create a separate department here. You would then create statuses according to the number of search you perform. Most libraries in North America generally do 3 searches before a purchase or withdraw decision is made. So you would create statuses for first, second, third, and reacquire. The thing to note here is these statuses will sort alphabetically according to the code. So it's a good idea to put a number in the code, 1 first, 2 second, etc., so that they sort correctly. Then, after you have performed a search of everything that is in the department, that is missing, you will work from the items in department list and select all of the items in each individual status and then increment them in the following order. You will first select everything that has a status of third and update that status to reacquire. You will then select everything with a status of second and update those to third. And then you will select everything with a status of first and update that to second. You can see why this order is important, because if you start with the first status, you can then iterate through and take everything through the entire process to reacquire with only doing one search. So it's important to do it in that order. And then, excuse me, and then when items are flagged for reacquisition, you can queue an acquisition technical services work order on that item to send that to the acquisitions department to place the order. If you are using purchase requests at your library, you could create a purchase request on that item, and then you would complete the search work order. The end result of utilizing this process for lost and missing searches is that items in a missing status are now actionable items. So you can then create a scheduled analytics report of items that are in a missing status. And then that missing status is not the terminal end of items that are missing, it's an action. You then place work orders on those missing items, move them into the search work order department, and move it through the process and clear that missing status. So missing is then action-based, not what it needs to be done. Okay, so let's talk really briefly about a couple of that analytics reports area within expert services. So again, as I mentioned, those reports are under the community reports, shared reports, expert services. Now this folder is not a folder that I actively maintain. I talk about these reports regularly, both when I am doing training workshops for customers that are implementation, as well as when I do any sort of post-go live premium services. So many people have access to these reports. They could break at any time. I will add things in there when I am at a site doing some sort of a post-go live service. If a customer asks for a report and I think that would be helpful to other people, I'll go ahead and throw it in this folder. It's always a best practice if you are working with any of these reports, please do save them in your own institution with a save as, so that the reports don't break for others. So I'm just going to call out a couple of reports in here that I think others might find interesting. So the first report is a report of all waived fines with the date that that fine was waived and the staff operator who performed that waive. This report was specifically created because there was a library that was concerned that they were allowing student workers to perform waiving of fines, and they wanted to make sure that those student workers weren't doing something they shouldn't. So they weren't, for example, you can see this primary identifier here of 26898 has done a large amount of waiving of their own $70 fines. So that could potentially be a red flag. Another report here is the items in lost status over 60 days. So these are items that have gone into the lost status 60 days or longer from today's date. I call this report out specifically for a reason, because this report has in it the SQL expression filter that allows you to do a rolling 60-day filter. I personally can never remember how to construct that SQL expression. So I put it into a report deliberately so that anyone who I talk to knows where this SQL filter lives. So my gift to you, this is where that is. There's also a report in here for purchase order line types. This can be utilized if you are looking at streamlining those purchase order line types, as we talked about at the very top of the hour. You can utilize this report to see what you're actually using in the system. And so if you more heavily use print book one time over physical one time, you may want to consider having that one set up instead. Okay. Finally, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about premium expert services that we offer here at Ex Libris through my team. We offer a number of premium expert services that are all available. You can reach out to me. The email address will be at the end of the presentation, and we can work with you to scope out what you might need. These are all paid services, but we can work with you to determine what might best fit your needs. We can do workflow on-site optimization and analysis of your workflows and tell you how you might be able to utilize Alma better. We can also help you set up new system functionality, such as resource sharing or acquisitions. And we can also do customized training sessions. And all of these sessions can be delivered either on-site or remotely. With the advent of COVID-19, we have pivoted to doing a lot of these services also remotely. Speaking of COVID-19, I also wanted to highlight that we do have the best practices for the Ex Libris community, the series of free webinars. So you'll want to look for the COVID-19 logo that's seen here on the CKC. And there you will find a page that is filled with resources for our products and links to register for the remaining live session. Speaking of remaining live sessions, there is also one session remaining tomorrow for effective usage of Primo Analytics. So if you're interested in that, you may want to go and register for that. And again, here is that email address. So if you want to ask more about expert services, feel free to reach out to that email address that goes to myself as well as others within management, and we will be happy to talk with you and figure out how we can help you out. Have a good rest of your week, your evening, if that is applicable for you, or your day. And stay safe, be well, and take care of your families.